We like to think of the workplace as a place of routine, a clock in, a clock out kind of world. But for many immigrants, and for the employers who hire them, work has become a legal maze. Today, we look at what it means to operate in the shadow of ICE, to lead in the face of changing rules, and to humanize the labor force behind the policy headlines. Welcome to this special episode of Human Solutions, simplifying HR for people who love HR from AIM HR Solutions. I'm Pete Wright, and today we're going to dig into one of the most misunderstood and under-discussed aspects of the American workplace, immigration. Our focus is on policy, sure, but even more important, it's people, it's fear. It's the daily decisions leaders have to make without a clear map. Joining us to help navigate this are two remarkable experts, Cristina Chavez of the MIRA Coalition and our very own Senior Vice President of Employer Services, Terry Cook. Let's get into it. Let's start with the air we breathe, with the fear. What does it mean in 2025 to feel unsafe at work? Cristina, I want to turn to you first. You work closely with employers. Can you walk us through what it looks like in the workplace today that relies on the critical contributions of immigrant employees?
Of course. And thank you, Pete, and thank you, Terry, for having me here today. It is my absolute pleasure. And I am so happy that there is a space being created around this topic right now, especially to the point of your question. There is so much confusion right now with immigration policies and how that might affect employees. And I hear these from employers all the time. And so much of the anguish comes from just knowing how to navigate this, right? How do we support our employees? How do we remain compliant? But we want to support our employees, right? And something that really stands out to me with your question is, especially with your introduction, is how important and how unsaid this is. So if you were to look at, for example, Massachusetts data, I would say around 1/4 to 1/3 of the workforce minimum makes up industries such as manufacturing, industries such as transportation and warehousing, the health aid space, like your employees that are taking care of your loved ones and your most vulnerable. Over 40% of those workers are foreign born. So when we're looking to this confusion today, it's not necessarily that there's a lot of policy coming down the line that's hard to understand. Is while that confusion is being hashed out in the courts and in the media, who is really feeling the burns of these are the employees with their uncertainty. So if you're uncertain, you might not want to go to work. You might be scared. You might be scared that you might get deported, or maybe someone in your family has gotten deported, so you might not show up to work. And I hear employers seeing the burns of that in their own workforce, because obviously you're going to have the interest of, I have to meet my compliance. I have to make sure I'm delivering and paying my own bills. But then there's the added layer of how am I supposed to help out my people and my workers navigating this? So you can definitely get into it down the line, but you described it very acutely that it very much is a maze. And the main concern that I am hearing from employers is that unfamiliarity of where do we even get those answers? Do we go through the government side? Do we go to policy teams? And things are changing so rapidly. That's so much of what I hear is where do we get the most up-to-date information right now?
You teased out some stats, the percentage of the immigrant workforce, and I'm curious if you have data that takes it one step further. The economic impact on the Massachusetts workforce, now that we have seen such action over the last 8 months.
Of course. Well, the data that I do have economic-wise, this was from 2023, but right now, I'm waiting for a new report to come out from the American Immigration Liberties Council. And so far, I think 2023 we had about $18.4 billion in taxes. So that's huge economic impact. And this is only in the state of Massachusetts. And out of that 18.4 billion, around 1.1 billion came from undocumented immigrants as well. So disrupting that narrative of, undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes, that's simply not true. And when we look at an economy such as Massachusetts, that's a huge amount of spending power. And imagine if that huge amount of money was taken out of the economy because, all of these policies of wanting to get people deported actually came true. That would actually have huge economic fallout. Like if, for example, refugees that are people that are coming to this country already qualified as refugees that are vetted outside of the United States, those folks pay up to $1.0 billion in taxes.
Well, it's insidious. Like you just don't, and until you put numbers to it, you don't anticipate just how much of an impact it is.
Exactly. For example, amount paid in rent by an immigrant-led household is 5.4 billion. So, but this is why these conversations are important, right? Because I understand when people are seeing and hearing so many things on the internet and from their family members, people with various political ideas. If we really want to boil it down to the numbers, the impact is there. And you can't deny that. Go to whatever economic think tank you want. Go look at the data. It's there. It's right in front of your face. No matter what your political ideologies are, which we all have many various different ones. At the end of the day, immigrants are holding up the state. They hold up the bulk of the U.S. work economy, and pretending as if they do not and minimizing that is incredibly harmful and dangerous, if I say so.
Terry, let's turn to you. Terry
Sure.
is also present. When Terry, you have a unique place in AIM because you work so directly with our members, right? When HR leaders call you, what do you find is keeping them up at night on this issue?
I think a lot of it is what Anna's already said. I mean, I think they're trying to figure out how to balance the compliance piece, making sure that they're doing what they need to do for their companies, but they also, as an HR person, have empathy towards the employees. So they're trying to figure out, what is that balancing act? On top of that, as you see in the media, there's all kinds of information on ICE raids and people coming into these workplaces and the fear of, what does that mean? How do I prepare for that? What do they have access to? What do I have to do and not do? So I think all of those things are keeping them up at night. They're thinking about their I-9s again. That's a big discussion, making sure that those are all intact and accurate. So I think it's, again, a balance of compliance, employees, and then being prepared.
I think you're both getting to some things that I want to make sure we highlight, which is we've got this economic impact, we've got this human impact, we also have this incredible individual impact, which is what is it like from an HR leader's perspective and from an immigrant employee's perspective who are living in a state of avoidance because of fear, afraid to take the train, afraid to, any sort of public transit, afraid to show up, afraid to speak out. What is the toll that's taking on these individual humans? And to what detriment does ignoring that imply frankly, a mental and emotional health crisis to come? That may be outside of the scope of this conversation, but Anna, I would love it if MIRA has had that conversation.
No, 100%, Pete. And honestly, I'm so glad that that's being talked on, because it can be really easy when we're talking in the scope of, we're talking about numbers, we're talking about making sure that, we're being compliant and supporting our employees. But if we zoom back for a second, imagine not knowing how your next paycheck is going to come in. And I feel like that can sound a little lightly when you say it, but actually thinking, if I don't go to work because I'm scared of what might happen to me on the public way to work, whether that's on a train, whether that's on a sidewalk. But if I don't go, I might not get paid. And how will I then meet my basic needs? And what if I'm also the sole provider of a family? Or maybe I have a child with special needs. That type of instability takes an enormous toll on your mental health. And I'm very proud to say that here at MIRA, we take the mental health of the immigrant community so seriously and so important, because not just what you might have endured in your home country that caused you to look at the United States as a place where you could contribute and come here and play a role. You also had to journey here. And that could have been incredibly traumatizing. And will I say, as an immigrant myself, immigrated here from Mexico at 15 years old, the immigration process in this country can also be incredibly complicated and harmful to go in, because you're constantly having to demonstrate your worth of being here while you're being told by media and politics that you don't deserve to be here. But your employers and this is where I think Terry, does an amazing job in how she's communicating this. They do care. Some of the people that have both supported me have been people that knew my situation and were in that unique role to uplift me and empower me to do better in my role and better contribute to being here. But that emotional impact, in my opinion, is not really talked about. I have had presentations where after we walk through everything, the next part of my conversation has to be, okay, let's talk about how childcare and how safety planning is going to look like if parent A or parent B were to be separated. Who are you going to call? And I see their looks on their faces, right? When you think, oh, who's going to take my children to the hospital? Who's going to pick them up from school? Who is their emergency contact? And having those conversations is not a light conversation to have for anyone that's had to have a conversation in the event of any separation. It's a traumatizing conversation to have. So folks are having to come to terms with these hypothetical, maybe not so hypothetical realities. And on top of that, you have to keep going to work because you have to provide for yourself. So I'll let Terry speak a little bit on this, but I'm very happy that that's also being highlighted because you can't not think about that when you're talking about the scope of the political impact this is having.
Yeah. And I think there's conversations happening in the workplace. I mean, amongst each other with employees. I think HR tends to be a place where some people feel like they can safely have some conversations of their concerns. And I do think that's a balance for them too, though, trying to figure out what they do tell the employer. In some instances, about family members, et cetera, that's a concern. But to your point too, Anna, that, there's a lot going on. It can be time consuming. Even trying to get things, all of the documentation correct that they need all the time, that takes time away from work as well. So it's really having those open conversations with employees. I think it's important to recognize that everyone's a person. Everyone's got real feelings in every situation, and we want them to be able to come to us and feel safe.
I think we're fully in the era that should be remembered as uncertainty as immigration policy. Immigration rules don't seem to change as much as they churn constantly. And for HR leaders, it's clearly hard to plan a workforce when the legal floor is always moving, right? There is no sense of stability. If I'm trying to be a good employer, where do I begin? Ana Cristina, what does proper paperwork mean in 2025?
No, that's a great question, Pete. And I looked at Terry because I feel like that can very much also hold Terry's question. But I will say from what I can speak to on my end is that I really want to acknowledge what you said about how difficult it can be as an employer to be thinking about not just hiring, but retaining and investing in your workforce when the legal floor, as you mentioned, is changing so often. What I would encourage employers to do, the first thing is, of course, it's a very real fear. And I really want to validate that because that's a very real concern for employers when you're thinking about your business and moving forward. The second thing that I do want to point out is that the legal floor is changing for your employees as well. And so what I do believe can be done by the employer is the good paperwork does start with doing that bit of homework. As Terry mentioned, it can be time consuming to make sure you have everything in a row and everything lined up. But for a lot of folks, for example, that are here on one of the many countries, not many at this point because a lot of them have TPS terminated, but for some countries that have TPS, a lot of the expiration dates of that status is being litigated. So it gets extended and then it doesn't and then it's extended. I have heard from folks that have had that employer take that extra time and say, okay, well, while your employment authorization card is saying that it's expiring. And so E-Verify is sending me alerts, right? But they had that extra conversation with that employee. They took the time to learn more about their situation as a human being. And they realized, oh, now you're sharing with me that maybe you have another immigration benefit that you applied to. But that's not the code that's in E-Verify. So actually, you might actually now be automatically allowed to work. It can get complicated, but there is right now, for example, we've had a Haiti designation of TPS. Right now is extended until February 2026. But there are folks that are going to have that card that says it expires sooner. So when you're talking about where does that paperwork start, I think it really does start where Terry mentioned about taking that time and creating that space with your employee to figure out, is there something else going on? Is there another classification of your status that might be more like hasn't expired that we could use in the system instead of the one we have now? And I think it starts there. And then you go into, okay, well then actually you're actually still out of work for 4 months. Okay, great. It might have taken them time. It might have taken a few days. The employee might have been out of work for a couple of days, but that paid off, right? And then you now have the trust of your employee because they know that you might do that for them. So they might even work harder for you. But I do think those conversations of good paperwork really does start with the employee.
Well, I started with you intentionally because I know the words proper paperwork are Terry's love language and that
like,
she could just take this and run. So
we'll be all over. 30 minutes
right.
gone.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, it's a risky question. But I will say, all right, Terry, so this is, our primary concern here, I think, not to put words in your mouth, it's about record keeping, right? The risks to not understanding the convoluted state of proper paperwork. Here you go. What do we do?
Well, I mean, I think going back to the basics of the I-9, you're looking at the I-9 and already went and compared that to there's documents that you might have on there that could be expiring. There's documents on there that you've been seeing in the news that might be getting pulled back. It's important to take a breath, stop, look at it, really figure out what's accurate. Following the USCIS website, it's critical. There's changes even as of this week. Anna, you already referred to one in Haiti, but there's changes all the time. So instead of assuming that somebody might not be able to stay, it's better to have a conversation. Look at the documents, look at what the status of everything is, because you don't want to discriminate against people by just saying, I think they might not be okay to stay. So I think that's what I'll just stop doing right now. I don't come across employers that want to have that kind of approach at all. I'm thankful that people that have called into us are looking to how to keep their employees. What can I do? And they'll have those conversations. But yeah, at the end of the day, the paperwork has to be in order. We have to have some type of an authorization to be at work. But there are other ways. What Anna was saying is that sometimes you don't realize. I had an employer call recently who was looking to keep people and was thankful after he received the email from E-Verify that Anna also referred to, had a conversation, and half of those people already had documentation and receipts to show that everything was moving forward the way it needed to for them to stay. So again, it's a matter of having the conversations and really, sure, you need to make sure everything is compliant, but having the conversations to see where things are instead of just having an immediate fear and overreaction.
I possibly a conversation that would require a help document that I'm about to ask this question. I'm going to open a box that I realize comes with some risk. You've now mentioned I-9 and E-Verify, and my understanding is that if those documents, that E-Verify, can I qualify that as sort of the gold standard, or is it just another tool in the kit? But secondarily, what are some of the more unusual or unfamiliar documents that would still technically authorize someone to work legally, and should, to what degree does HR need to be ready to verify them properly? So talking about both the broad E-Verify statement and the niche sort of dark corners of immigration validation, where do you start? What do you need to be ready for as an HR pro?
I think E-Verify, it's not required that companies participate in E-Verify. There are certain situations that they are. There's certain states, for example, not Massachusetts, but there's also federal and contractors and so forth that have a requirement. But outside of that, many employers do utilize E-Verify. It is, to your point, Pete, something that will come back and it'll give you the exact information that you need as an employer to know if somebody is authorized to work. And they're also in the habit now of sending alerts when anything gets changed, so that these same employers that have utilized them can see what's going on and what's coming up potentially. Again, as Anna also said, there's a lot of litigation out there, so there's a lot of changes potentially to come. I think it's just really important for people to just have all of their knowledge ahead of time, especially whether they use E-Verify or not. I can say on a separate note with E-Verify that some HR people have definitely utilized it if they didn't have to, is because there's an option to do remote verification of I-9 documentations with E-Verify, and there's not one post-COVID without it. So there's a few reasons people utilize E-Verify. Right now, I think the alerts that are coming in are helping companies to kind of stay on top of things.
And also E-Verify can be kind of a scary situation, right? Depending on the population.
It can, yeah. You just have to, again, I've noticed somebody sent me the E-Verify notification they received. And I have to say the nice thing is they may have made an alert to some things that might need to be looked at, but they also are very clear to be cautious. Don't just react. Talk to the person. See if there's other things, as Anna also said, there's maybe something else they can provide to you. There's receipts when people are in process. They might not have it in their hands right now, but when you have an official receipt in HR, you utilize that. You attach that to your I-9 document to know that if somebody came in to do an audit, you were able to prove this is why that person's able to stay. There's a receipt here proving that they have some documentation coming through.
Before I turn attention back to Anna, Terry, your that implies a systems approach. Do you have advice for keeping track of expiring visas and documents and receipts and TPS deadlines?
I think anytime you have re-verifications of any type, you want to make sure I used to keep it either on a calendar or a spreadsheet of sorts, just as a reminder to say, here's some re-verifications that need to be happening this month, and this month. And again, those things are changing differently than they did 10, 20, 30 years ago because it was a re-verification at one point. But now that there's so much litigation, as Anna also said, bouncing back and forth, you not only have to look at that spreadsheet, but you also have to look at the USCIS site to see what is going on with dates getting extended and really altering that. But really a system, to your point, Pete, is some type of a system approach is going to be most helpful to keep compliant.
I find what Terry's saying extraordinarily valuable because I'm always so heartened to hear when folks in the position that Terry's in, you are advising folks in HR departments about hundreds of organizations. And it's that type of mindset of let's take a beat. Let's take a breath. Let's try to breathe through the crises, which I think as humans can be very difficult to do. Personally, something I have to work through. And I work at a job where I feel like we listen to crises every day. And I think that that's so important what Terry's saying, because it really does show up in your compliance side as well. Like we have receipts, we collected them. And on the other side of it, I know so many folks that can now go to their employers because they know that their employers might have a copy of an important document that maybe they misplaced. Or so I think I could hear Terry talk about this all day, essentially.
Don't say that to Pete.
Right. I know. It's all over. What do you, let's just one sort of sideline comment on this documentation issue. Cases where, to your point this week, documents change over time. Someone who you have receipts and their status changes, sort of out from under them. How do you handle those cases in particular? The stress, the trauma, the uncertainty, and potentially what is the recourse?
So I'm thinking back to, when I've had conversations with employees and employers precisely about this. And I would say the first thing that comes to mind, as you mentioned, when someone's status gets flipped over overnight, and that means that it's not just their status that got flipped over, it's everything that's tied to that social security number, right? It might be any sort of loan or not. It might be your job. It might be, qualifying for some type of assistance that that you qualify for because of where you fall underneath the poverty line. And so much of your day-to-day stability that, while for us might be a given, for folks is not anymore. So that can be incredibly traumatizing. What I do think when it comes to this is I really just keep going back to taking a beat because, as you said, there's so many things that may or may not be impacting that situation. So, for example, I know that there might be times where employers might get served, a notice of inspection or something, and that might cause panic to the employer, in which case the employee is going to be causing panic. But even in those situations, you can have a little bit of a delay. Like even if I believe, and Terry might know this, probably knows this better than I do. I believe it's 72 hours, 3 days, where you could have that
with a
delay.
notice of inspection. Yeah. With not a nice raid, but yeah, when you get an NOI and a notice of inspection, yes, 3 days.
Exactly. So I think when what are the recourses for that? It really is, if we really are talking about work, it really is. I'm really hoping that person is in a position where they can go to their employer and explain the situation. That being said, I really want to point out that immigration trauma is very real because it really is intertwined with everything in our lives. It's intertwined in the public health system. It's intertwined with our stability to get a job. It's intertwined in our ability to get a loan to pay rent. Like it covers a lot of gaps. It's not just resigned to, my status. It really, think about all the times that you're filling out paperwork and you're asked if you're a U.S. citizen or not, if you have a social security number or not. So I think I also want to make space for the fact that there might be a lot of employees that might not feel safe coming to employers, not because you're not someone that they don't trust, but because inherently it is a very vulnerable, scary thing that you're being affected with. So in terms of recourses, I always encourage folks to reach out to community organizations in the area. I know MIRA, we have about 150 organizations underneath our coalition. And on our website, there's a map, in which case, in the event that, for example, Terry's speaking to an employer and they have employees in a certain part of Massachusetts, I would be able to say, you know what, Terry, we have a couple of member orgs out there. Let's see if we can connect you to them. And they might be better suited to give them those personal, maybe more relational support than an employer might be able to. So I would definitely encourage folks. And also to bring it back to what Terry said before, when we're thinking about what to do, a lot of nonprofit organizations in immigration like MIRA, we have a lot of policy updates that we're refreshing weekly. So don't, of course, check the USCIS website, but also talk to policy organizations as well to see what's going on. And those folks will have resources in that specific area that your employee might be from as well.
In Massachusetts, sorry, Pete, I just want to mention real quickly that in Massachusetts, Governor Healy and the Attorney General released recently a guideline for employers to use on immigration. That's helpful, I think. So
yeah, that's incredibly helpful, Terry, and I'm really happy you brought that up. I have it pulled up on my screen every day when I'm talking to employers, and it really, and I think just even having information is so powerful and it can be so empowering. Even if the answer is incredibly depressing, we have that information now that we can learn how to work with it.
We have a question from one of our member employers that I think it seems small, and yet it has magnitude. If I sponsor someone for an H-1B and they post something risky on social media, could I be in trouble? It is a question that I feel like is sort of soaked in fear and the same uncertainty about enforcement priorities. Is there any truth to this concern about employers specifically being targeted based on the behavior of the workers they sponsor?
I hear what you're saying, and I think that question, I can hear the uncertainty behind it. I will say I do think that question might fall a little bit outside of my breadth of knowledge, but what I can say to that is that usually social media monitoring, as we have seen, is definitely increasing, but that is more so about that worker. As far as I know, ICE investigations into employers can be for a lot of different reasons, not just because of that person's status. And a good friend of mine that works at Morgan & Lewis was the one that told me, it's like there's a lot of focus on immigration enforcement right now, but there's always been a history of law enforcement present at work sites and investigations. So when it comes to your effect on social media about your employee, I have yet to hear of that happening in our policy circles. That being said, I would advise, as we do advise anyone that currently is in the United States right now, social media monitoring is very real. And what we might perceive as not being risky, we have very much seen that the government is taking as almost, as an attack or inflammatory. And while I think everyone, we have the right to protest and we have the right to free speech, we have seen that being weaponized against us right now. So I would actually respond with that a bit. But again, that I have seen being attacks against the employer, I have yet to hear about that. But if that's something that other folks are hearing about, I would love to hear about that more, because I always want to learn about what employers are facing in this field too.
Well, Terry, we've talked about social media policies a number of times on this show. How, given the context in which we gather today, how do you recommend employers think about social media and personal conduct in this political climate?
It's always tough. You have to have a social media policy. You want to make sure your employees know what to expect. At the same time, they have a personal life. They have their time. They will refer to the freedom of speech, but they have to understand that there's certain things that can be protected of social media and other things, as Anna's referring to, that we can't possibly even know what's being looked at and viewed. I think sometimes that question also might come from, I think some people have heard stories in the media where if somebody, they might find somebody that has an issue that I don't know if they got a social media or where they found out, but then all of a sudden they find out where that employee works. And then they're suddenly targeting that workplace. So I think that's a real fear out there right now, too, is when people think that there's one potential connection that can lead them to that company. So I think just being aware and letting people know what the policy is.
You've mentioned NOIs, notices of inspection, and now we're going to level up. ICE shows up. The moment that no employer wants to imagine the knock at the door. What happens next? So we're going to talk about rights, but we also need to talk about geography, because where someone stands quite literally can change what the law allows. So, Anna Cristina, kick us off. What is the difference between a public and a private space in the workplace, and why does it matter here?
Great introduction to this very, very important topic that really does need to be distinguished, as you said. So is essentially the difference between a public and a private space boils down to where you have that expectation of privacy. So I'm going to zoom out for a little bit. And so when we're talking about our rights, the ones in the scope of this conversation, we're talking about the Fourth and the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, right? So the Fourth Amendment is the right of people to be secure in their persons, their houses, their papers, and their effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. And the Fifth Amendment, it gives you the right to remain silent and due process. So now that we have that context, when we're thinking about public versus private areas in your workplace, that is essentially public areas are where the public is largely invited to enter, because in those public areas, there's no reasonable expectation of privacy. And entry by government agents is typically not considered to be a search. For example, a lobby, a reception area, a waiting room, a showroom, retail floors, customer service counters, anywhere where you and I can walk in, we don't need a permission to be in. That's a public space in which, again, we don't have that reasonable expectation of privacy. Now, a private area in the workplace, in contrast, is for which a judicial warrant or employer consent, and that's a very, very big or here, or employer consent, are required before they can be accessed by a government agent. And those areas typically include back offices, employee break rooms, storage rooms, workshops or production areas, for example, like, thinking of here in the podcast, any place not accessible to customers, any areas behind employee only or any similar signs, or any private meeting in HR rooms. So I can segue right into warrants if you would like me to, but I want to make sure that we're answering very questions.
I want to clarify, of course, you start talking about this and I immediately think, okay, what about banks? What about bank tellers, right? There is a public-private, I would perceive that as a public-private separation, but it might just be a counter, right? We don't invite the public behind the counter where the safes and the money is, and yet, is that considered a private space? I know. When's the last time you bought a ticket at a movie theater without buying it online first? But a movie theater window, right? You walk up to a window. We don't invite people behind that window. But
that is also that too. And I think that's a great question that you answered, because I had a presentation a couple of weeks ago with an amazing restaurant group, and they have some restaurants, for example, have like this open close concept of a kitchen. Like you go and you sit. And that was something that we talked about, because at the end of the day, even though it's blurred, that is still a private space. And what I would actually say to that is the key there is to make sure that any private space is very, very, very clearly distinguished and marked. Because, for example, as you said, if I'm at a bank and the bank window, it should be clearly marked, only employees past this point. That's the mark. That's what's telling me as a regular person, that's what should be telling agents. This is where the public space ends. Now, where it obviously can get nuanced is those two things I mentioned about warrants and about employer consent. So when we're talking about having warrants, that the warrant is what basically overrides that sense of, well, I can now enter this private space because of the reasons listed in the scope of this warrant. The only warrants that can override that sense of public space are judicial warrants that are signed by a judge or a magistrate. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion in the public comes from, because the warrant will give you a scope. They're looking for, and they have the description of what's being searched or who's being arrested. They should have the name and the address correctly listed and the date of that execution as well. Where employer consent gets tricky is, say, for example, an agent or any federal enforcement officer shows up, let's use the bank example, and they want to go into the back to search. They want to go into the bank and search some of the files. And if the employer gives them permission to do so, anything goes. They no longer have they don't have a scope of a warrant to stick to, which is why even if you might not have, it's not necessarily that you want to have something to hide, but that is what the Constitution sets you up to protect you. And it's exactly why it's so important to understand when an agent shows up to your work, what type of documentation they have. Because an ICE warrant, for example, does not give agents the constitutional right to go into a place to which you're not giving consent to. Now, how can they go into those spaces if you as the employer give consent to enter private spaces? So the employer actually plays a really important role in limiting where ICE can and cannot enter workspaces. Again, that really can't be understated, how important that role is.
Well, and I want to highlight that if I'm understanding you correctly, if the employer gives consent for ICE to come in and search files that happen to be located in a private space, if there are workers whose status is in question happen to be in that private space, they could be arrested, detained, whatever, just by virtue of the fact that, as you said, anything goes.
The agents could then say that the employer gave them consent to go into that space. And in that sense, they're going to either question or detain or arrest whomever they think they have the discretion to do so. But the argument there will be, well, we were giving consent by the employer.
And I think what she's saying is true. What Anna's saying is obviously it's not only true, but it's important for a company to have a process, have a procedure in place to say, okay, if somebody comes here, who is the contact person? Who is going to talk to these people? Because you don't want just anybody interacting, because as Anna said, if you go up to Pete and say, hey, Pete, can I go back there into the production floor? And Pete's like, yeah, sure, whatever. Want to go back there, go ahead. Well, now they're going to have the consent that they need. Whereas if you have this whole process identified and you know who is going to be the people interacting, what are the steps? Of course, people getting in their immigration attorneys involved and so forth, getting a look at those warrants, because as Anna said, some of them are judicial. Some of them are not judicial. So making sure that people understand all of that. So it's important to have that in place in advance.
What do you recommend, Terry? Like you're digging into this thing that I think a lot of people are going to be dealing with, preparing people on the ground, front desk managers, concierge, whatever, shift leads. How do you prepare them to be ready to be the frontline people who first interact with ICE representatives? And are employees legally obligated to answer questions, direct questions from ICE? Can ICE just come in and take people from the premises? How do you prepare your teams when there may not be an authority around to represent the business?
It is about getting the rapid response your whole team ready. It's about education. It's about communication, making sure everybody knows, what do you do when somebody comes in? Who is the first contact? What do you not do? it's really about having this, what we call a rapid response team. And that could be not only for ICE, it could be for anything and the employer might interact with it. There's a lot of agencies that can come in to the, place of employment to ask questions. It could be OSHA, it could be local law enforcement. It's just really important that each company has a plan in place to deal with all of this.
The big question, and this is for both of you, is if I'm sitting here thinking, okay, I'm an HR leader or a business owner, how do I walk the line? How do I balance protecting employee rights without violating my obligations as a business? Right? Like that seems to be a really tricky space that we're wandering through. And maybe it's something we can't answer explicitly right now, but I want to open the floor for it if you have thoughts.
Like I said, I just think you always have to have knowledge. You have to, knowledge is really power at this point. You have to really be able to understand where things are at, how people need to respond in different situations. I just think those two things are quick notes on my end, but I'll let Anna speak.
I think I want to acknowledge that what Terry mentioned about having that response in place and knowing, who's going to be that first person that's going to react. What is their role? Who are they going to call? What is going to come next? That is so important to know. And what I will say in answer to your question is, for me and my experience in hearing everything that's been going on the ground, it really comes down to knowing what your rights are. And that is going to give you that. Again, agents might not always respect that, and not just agents, but other law enforcement agencies. But if you have that knowledge, as Terry mentioned, that in itself is empowering. Because, for example, just if ICE were to show up, everyone has a right to remain silent. That's not you not complying with your duties as a business owner. That is you, and this is my take, right? But that is you exercising your right to remain silent. We never encourage folks to interfere with arrests because that can be extremely harmful and that can put a lot of people at risk. But you do not have to facilitate any of those actions. As an employer, you do not have to confirm or deny if someone is there, because you can simply just remain silent. Or you can come up with a policy such as the one that Terry is referring to. But we can come up with a policy in which you train your staff to say, I am not authorized to provide any information regarding our company or any of our employees. It is our company policy that I refer you. And if you exercise that, and again, this is my take, I don't believe that that's you not complying with your responsibility as a business owner. I believe that's you exercising your right to remain silent. And at the end of the day, one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever heard from a friend of mine in employment immigration is, the more your employers and yourself sound like a broken record, the better off it can be. Because at the end of the day, you kind of have a wall. We're not remaining silent. We're not divulging any information. And we're directing you to either upper management or legal counsel. And then those folks can be the ones to maybe hash it out a little more with agents. But to your point, I think from the immigrant rights standpoint and from our right to be here and work, standing up for our rights for privacy, I fundamentally don't believe that that goes against, the responsibilities of a business owner. I do want to recognize, though, that there will be times that it feels like those are butting heads. And I want to recognize that that space is not an easy distinguish to make. I can have, and we can have our thoughts and opinions about this, but it's an incredibly difficult situation. And I see this a lot, especially in immigrant business owners as well. And I think the best resources that we can offer is knowing, if you don't know what your rights are, maybe you're confused, here are our resources. Like, we're not going to gatekeep any sort of resource of information. Here is the employer guidance. Let me give you what the National Immigration Legal Center put out. Here are the most recent policy updates. Let me give you every single piece of information that you might need so that you can then make the best decision for yourself or make the best decision for their employees. But it really does come down to what Terry said, that I believe is knowledge really is power, because it's not only then how you're going to exercise them, but in the event that one of those rights gets violated, I do think that's when change happens. It's when those violations are noted and social change can follow that.
Yeah, as Anna said, it's important not to interfere. You don't ever want to be looked at as don't want somebody to see you as trying to harbor or do anything illegal. If somebody does have a judicial warrant and they're going through the steps that they are supposed to be taking in the scope that Anna mentioned, monitor. Make sure you're taking notes, you're tracking all of the information that's happening, if anything's getting taken. So there's a lot of steps to be taken. Again, it's really about having your rapid response plan in place, your checklist, just something where you're educating other people in the workplace.
Well, this is all a fantastic segue to, I think, our opportunity to really highlight the work that MIRA is doing in the advocacy space. What are you all up to, influencing policy in this space?
I really appreciate that question, Pete. I am very, very proud to be working at an organization that has such a rich history in policy advocacy. We have been around since, I believe, 1987, and we have steadily grown over the years. And MIRA's policy really does come from listening to our member organizations that are on the ground and listening to what's going on in the immigrant communities in Massachusetts. And then we take that to our relationships in the State House. So, for example, right now, we currently have 2 bills in the State House. And one of them is about the Safe Communities Act, in which it would essentially finish disentangling the relationships between ICE officers and police departments in Massachusetts, while Boston is under the Trust Act, and we're incredibly grateful for Mayor Wu. Then the rest of the state of Massachusetts still have some law enforcement that coincides with ICE. And so one of those bills is to disentangle that. The other bill that we're currently working on is the Immigrant Legal Defense Act. So essentially, and we actually just got a huge win on this, I believe, a few weeks ago. We currently got about $5 million in funding from the State House, which is incredibly exciting. And our hope with that bill is that we will able to have a mix of private and public funding to allow for immigration representation allocated through nonprofits to be able to represent immigrants in the United States, which I've been in the immigration field for a long time, and I can't tell you the difference it makes. Or when you have an attorney in immigration court proceedings, it makes about your chances increase. I don't want to give the incorrect stats, but it increases a lot. And if you want to think about so many people that come here as kids that are in court without an attorney, that you could be eligible for 5 different things, but you don't have an attorney to walk you through those things. So I'm really excited for the work that we're doing. And hopefully it is my very, very dear wish that as we have these conversations, really want employers to recognize that you hold a lot of power and your voice is so important in this work, because employers have such a unique insight into not just the Massachusetts workforce, but the economy and how that's influencing. And you're seeing on the ground what it means when a huge bulk of your employees start to have fear. And I think that insight is so unique. And so we are very much encouraging employers, if you are interested, maybe you want to reach out to your legislator, maybe you want to write a letter in the newspaper, maybe you want to come with us to the State House one day. We would be more than happy to have you and be more than happy to provide you with any resources that you would feel comfortable. Because I also do want to recognize policy advocacy can feel scary, especially for maybe employers that, maybe have more moderate political opinions, but they care very deeply about what's happening to their workers. And to that, I say, let's have a conversation, and any which way that employers want to step up and take it a bit of a step further, we would provide support every step of the way.
Outstanding. And I think, Terry, I know we don't have our lobbying friends from AIM with us,
yes,
but you happen to also be a part of an organization that has an advocacy responsibility to
That's
Massachusetts organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have guidance as to what AIM is doing?
Well, I think it's always important, as you said, that we have advocacy in a lot of different areas that have impact employers. So I think if people would certainly be a part of our website, we have our blogs open all the time, and our government affairs team, our great government affairs team is really wonderful about updating on anything that they're looking at currently and weighing in on what's going to happen in the state and what could be expected in the state. So I would say in general, I think that, referring over to the website and really understanding and seeing live what's going on with the government affairs team is the best resource.
As we wrap up, I've got one final question for each of you, and I hope this is a question that leads to responses of hope. Here it is. Ana Cristina, what gives you hope when you talk to employers and employees about navigating this system? Is there anything right now that gives you hope?
That is a very nice way to end this conversation, Pete. Thank you very much for that question.
You're very welcome.
I will say these conversations give me hope. I'll be more specific. Even the way you opened up the podcast about acknowledging the uncertainty and fear and acknowledging that humanity, when employers don't just acknowledge the fact that, I care about my employees because not only, they're making my business successful, but, I have developed this rapport with them. It really is when immigrant workers are seen as human beings, because we are. And that is how that is the shape of the narrative. It's not, the workforce contributes to X amount of which we do, but it's so much more than that. So when conversations are framed in that humanity and that shared existence that we have by folks like you and Terry that are in this space, that you not only are opening up this conversation, you have a lot of reach in this space. That gives me hope.
That is a great answer. Terry, I will give you a last shot too.
Yeah.
I know. Well, there is this. I'm talking now to the nervous HR leader, right, who just wants to do the right thing. How do you give them hope, Terry?
Well, I think the hope is just in empowering yourself with knowledge and talking to other HR people, talking to different groups like MIRA, talking and continuing the conversation with, AIM Government Affairs Department to say, these are what's important to us, and, finding out what you need to know that you don't know. I think the worst thing people can do is to just say, I don't want to know anything about this because it sounds like really scary stuff. So I think I'll just pretend it's not happening. Obviously in HR, you really can't do that. But in all honesty, it's if you can take the time to really learn what you need to learn and get things ready at your workforce and your workplace, I think it just benefits you. It benefits the company. It benefits the employees. It's just a matter of keeping the knowledge, the knowledge up to date. And I do know how hard it is. I know HR people have their hands in 100 different things at once. Being in that field myself for a lot of years, I understand that. But it's this type of area and this type of time right now, it's going to be crucial to be prepared, to just be ready and to educate yourself.
Well, I hope what folks get out of listening to this conversation is that at the end of the day, we're all about compliance here at Human Solutions. Compliance is big. It's like the Hollywood sign on the mountain, compliance. But it really isn't just about compliance, right? This is a conversation about compassion. It's about finding a way to build workplaces that feel like havens and not checkpoints. And that's the spirit that I get out of this conversation. Thank you both so much. Terry, I've been a fan of yours for a long time. Ana Cristina Chavez, you're fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. I am now a fan of yours. Huge.
I am a huge fan of AIM. Very, very
excellent.
much so.
Yeah. You just have to remember the people, right, Pete?
Remember
that's
the people.
AIM is all about, just helping businesses and people. So,
and speaking of people, to all the people listening, many of the questions and talking points for today's conversation came from you, our incredible AIM members. If you came away with questions, remember AIM members can reach out to the HR helpline at 800-470-6277 or helpline at aimnet.org for inquiries Monday through Friday from 8:30 to 5 Eastern. Email requests responded within 24 hours. We will put links to all the resources we've discussed today on the website and in the show notes for this podcast rebroadcast of this live event. Be on the lookout at aimhrsolutions.com, and you can listen to the show right there on the website or subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else fine podcasts are served. On behalf of our fantastic guests, Ana Cristina Chavez of MIRA and our very own Terry Cook, I'm Pete Wright, and we'll see you next time right here on Human Solutions.